I mean, the fact is the war on Christmas is real, but Bill, it's a part of a larger war against Christianity that's being waged around the world.
ALISTAIR Lichten, thanks so much for coming on to talk beliefs from your home in Sussex, right here in the UK. You are head of education at the National Secular Society and speak and write about secularism, as well as many education-related topics such as ending compulsory worship in schools. Well, it seems every time I do an interview, I'm having to mention a current lockdown, and those of us living around London are experiencing that yet again. So how does lockdown affect you and your family, ALISTAIR? Do you find it gives you more or less time to get on with your education work?
Well, Mark, first of all, thanks so much for having me. I might just say, if any of your audience aren't familiar, that the National Secular Society is a UK organisation which campaigns for the separation of religion and equal respect for everyone's human rights, so no one is advantaged or disadvantaged because of their beliefs. Lockdown. I'm in tier 2, teetering on the edge of tier 3 here in Sussex, and there's no doubt that COVID has had a massive impact on all of our work. I actually returned from paternity leave on the 1st of April this year, and the very first thing I had to do on my first day back was cancel 13 different events, and I went on to cancel several more over the next few months. The COVID crisis, it's just dominated the news and also the political agenda to such an extent that other really important work just isn't getting the public attention that it needs. There was already a big demand on the government's bandwidth, and we're seeing lots of issues that civil servants are very slow to respond to, even more so than normal. And you can have some really great work you've done that just no one in the media is interested in picking up, because they're just doing wall-to-wall COVID stories. On the other hand, it has to be said, the tragedy of so many pupils missing out on schools does mean, for someone who works in education, that but I have less casework coming up, so I've been able to step back from the news cycle. I still had lots of parents and teachers and pupils getting in touch, needing support and advice on issues this year, but markedly less so than previous years. So I focused more on longer term research over the last 9 months.
As it is very close now to Christmas 2020, I thought it would be good to get you on the show and talk about the so-called war on Christmas that rears its ugly head most Decembers. It's a topic that you've spoken about a lot, most recently on the NSS podcast. But I also hear that you actually researched the war on Christmas for your master's degree. Is that right?
Yes, yes to both. I think the great thing about the podcast, as I'm sure you can relate to, is that you can explore topics that you're interested in rather than simply following the news. Although it is nice to be doing an episode about the war on Christmas with the Christmas tree up and the Christmas jumper on. Yeah. I've been fascinated by the whole war on Christmas mythology for years, and probably since the start of my master's thesis, which I wrote on the role of victimhood narratives on the US Christian right, what we might now term Christian nationalism. And the war on Christmas wasn't the main focus, but my main focus was on this narrative that, particularly in America, that majority Christian groups are being persecuted by political correctness, people's rights being taken, minorities getting, uppity, maybe might say, and that traditional predominantly white Christian privilege being taken away. And the war on Christmas narrative is an example of that narrative, but where Christmas is like the wrapping paper or the seasonal variant of what is already an existing narrative.
But before we dive into the origins of the war on Christmas and what is exactly meant by the war on Christmas, let's just hear a bit more about some of the other interesting work that you're involved in at the National Secular Society. A very big topic is that of faith schools. So how much of a presence do faith schools have in Western society? And what should the general public be aware of in terms of their influence?
I'm assuming we're mainly talking about state schools within the UK. The UK is pretty unique among Western democracies in the extent to which we have religious institutions within our state education system. Other countries do have more of a private religious school sector. We have also, I say, a very big private religious school sector in the UK that brings its own issues. But that's almost separate to our work on issues in state schools. I'm not sure, as your audience may or may not be aware, around a third of our state-funded schools in Britain are faith schools. Northern Ireland, which is of course the fourth constituent part of the UK, is a bit different. More than 90% of pupils in Northern Ireland, more than 90% of school places in Northern Ireland are effectively segregated along religious lines. So at the NSS, although I work across a very broad range of education work, the most important area of my work is coordinating the national No More Faith Schools campaign. And that's a campaign to firstly stop the establishment of new state-funded faith schools and eventually move towards an entirely secular, what we would call a community ethos school system. You can find out more at nomorefaithschools.org and even find out if there's any local action going on in your area. It's difficult to talk in generalities about faith schools because the types of faith schools and our work on the issue is so varied. The biggest distinction is that faith schools vary in the extent to which they practice religious discrimination and how aggressively and in what ways they promote their religious ethos. So you may be familiar with a sort of faith school where it's technically a faith school and they do sort of prayer and stuff, but by and large on a day-to-day basis religion isn't very heavily pushed. Or you might be familiar with a type of faith school where most of the teachers are selected because they are evangelical about the faith. There's massive discrimination in admissions, and they find every single subject and nook and cranny they can force faith into. This year, going back to having the chance to step back and look at research, we published research showing that in England, 130,000 pupils have been sent to faith schools against their parents' wishes since 2014. That's building on long-term research which we've led, demonstrating the extent to which in many parts of the country there is little choice but a faith school. That's something that I often find people who have not been raised or have not gone to school in the UK, many parents may be immigrants or one of them or other, and they often just are shocked and surprised and think this is completely outrageous. This year, we've also published research on how new faith schools are opening really without any public scrutiny and without any meaningful consultation. A big part of my work is actually supporting local campaigns, which has been very disrupted by COVID, as you can imagine. I also do a lot of work advising parents and educating the public about the harms of faith schools. It's very important for my work that I am not here presenting all faith schools as the very worst, because that's just not people's experience. I need to talk about the harms caused by the whole range of faith schools, including the harms caused by faith schools which are much more moderate and much actually closer to the sort of community schools that we'd like to see. And as I think I mentioned at the beginning, that's all in the state sector. But increasingly over the last few years, we're seeing substantial issues in the private faith school sector. Including in unregistered schools, and some areas of elective home education can cause issues. That might be going down too much of the rabbit hole though to get into right now.
Yeah, something perhaps we can talk about another interview in the future, Alistair.
Very happy to.
Right, let's move on to the so-called War on Christmas. Alistair, for anyone who doesn't know, what is meant by the War on Christmas and what are its origins?
The myth of the War on Christmas has evolved over time. There's been different iterations of it. It can probably be distilled into something like, if I say, the idea that a nefarious group or forces are attempting to either corrupt, marginalize or in extreme case ban Christmas, usually as part of an attack on the West or on Christianity specifically. As far as I'm aware, it has its roots in the 1920s, but it may be related to earlier persecution myths. My research is much more on the modern iterations. I should be clear that the myth of the war on Christmas is distinct. It's absolutely distinct from the actual persecution of Christians and the Christmas festival that has occurred and is occurring in other places. So when we hear of the war on Christmas, this is people complaining about secular Christmas adverts. This is not, the Saudi religious police breaking up a house church. Just as when we hear about Christian persecution in the West, we're actually generally speaking about Christians being upset that they need to serve gay people, rather than a church being raided and Christians are horribly attacked by Hindu nationalists in India. This is the myth of persecution in areas where Christians are privileged, not the actual persecution in areas where Christians are actually persecuted.
Now, there are quite a few myths, as you said, going around the war on Christmas and centered around the war on Christmas. And this idea of religious persecution in general, such as these stories some Christians tell of Christmas parties being banned in offices or even in schools. So can you tell us about that?
Yes, I mean there are lots of examples, and your audience may be familiar with or have some favorites. They all tend to blur into a couple of categories for me, I have to say, and I'm more interested in the underlying ideas behind the myth and why it's popular, rather than getting into arguments over specific examples. If we try to keep the focus more on the UK, perhaps, I would say that the modern war on Christmas myth, the foundational myth, the genesis that brought this very much into the public attention, is actually quite old now, and it goes back to 1997. And maybe some of the audience might have some memories triggered if I say this word, Winterville. So I'll tell you the story behind it, but this is 1997. This has had very an enduring legacy, this myth. So it's 1997. Birmingham City Council decide, we've got lots going on over the next couple of months. We've got Christmas, Diwali, Guy Fawkes Night, New Year's Eve. We've got all these things going on, and we want to get people to come into the town centre to spend their money in shops. So they decided to produce a brochure called Winterville about the whole range of festivals going on over the few months. I think it even included Halloween. And it was very clear that Christmas was the biggest part of this, and that seems like might seem like quite a good idea for a savvy local council to do. However, this was twisted in certain areas of the press, particularly the Daily Mail, and it was presented as this loony left-wing council full of socialists and cultural Marxists, and they're trying to ban Christmas, and they're replacing Christmas with Winterville, and it's going to be called a Winterville tree and all this. The Daily Mail were eventually forced to print a retraction because the story just wasn't true. However, you still hear, and it's come up in Parliament, it regularly comes up in the press, you hear it on social media all the time. Oh yeah, well, they once tried to place Christmas with Winterville. Never happened, but it has had a very long enduring idea. Councils often, to save money, councils might put up Diwali lights and Christmas lights at the same time, and they might just call them winter lights, or they might try and choose some symbols to put on their lampposts that light up and look nice, that work for Diwali and for Christmas. And the reason for that is to save money. It's a practical thing. But you even hear people complain, oh, they put up Diwali lights but not Christmas lights, and it's the same lights. As I said, lots of these examples are these types of stories. I think more in terms of types of stories than necessarily specific examples. So I just jotted down some of the things that they've got people in the UK who think there's a war on Christmas particularly worked up. A big one is Christmas stamps. I don't know. Perhaps this year, being socially distanced, you might be sending more Christmas cards in the post than normal, and you'll notice that the day you may have noticed a few years, the Royal Mail have had basically an informal policy of alternating Christmas stamps from year to year. So one year they have like a secular one. I think they may have had Harry Potter at some point, and the next year they have a very religious one, and the next year they have a sort of, a secular one. So maybe it'd be Frozen or some Disney thing.
Yes, it alternates. Yeah.
Yeah, it effectively alternates, and every year there are some Christian groups complain, and they get very angry that that Christmas is the real reason of the festival is being wiped out by this secularization, and the Royal Mail must do very religious Christmas cards next year. I think one year they actually did both religious and secular stamps together, and I think the secular ones just were more popular.
Yeah,
but it's interesting that this year the Royal Mail have decided for a second year in a row to go with a very religious Christmas stamp. And now I don't think anyone on the kind of secular side is really that upset about this. But it's interesting that there's a very strong suggestion that's because of the amount of pressure that's happened over these years when they've done secular stamps. And I do have to feel very sorry for whoever works in the Royal Mail press department around this time of year if they do a secular stamp.
Like damned if you do, damned if you don't, sort of.
Yes. There's also issues around cards and advent calendars. So, shops are commercial organizations. WH Smith is going to, if they're choosing what to buy, should they buy lots of Christmas cards, lots of advent calendars with pop culture things on it that kids are going to like, or should they buy very religious stuff? And obviously they tend to buy the more pop culture, the more secular ones. They just tend to do better. Yeah, definitely. I mean, difficult to find an advent calendar that's not owned by Disney. But every year you have some news stories created, or some press release from some Christian organization complaining about it's impossible nowadays to get a religious advent calendar because we're so embarrassed about our Christian heritage. And it's like, well, I mean, if people wanted them, they'd buy them, and they'd be more on sale. Adverts, we love in this country to complain about different adverts that they often trigger a very a war on Christmas narrative. So some people get very upset when adverts attempt to be inclusive. So we've seen supermarket adverts complained about because they've featured a woman in a hijab in it. I mean, if you go to Asda's on a Saturday, you're going to see someone in a hijab. This is 21st century Britain. But people get very upset that when Christmas adverts are attempting to be inclusive and they're secular and they're not talking about the real reason for the season. But then equally, many advertisers, if they try to be clever and incorporate maybe some religious or sacrilegious stuff into their adverts, so a cheese company celebrating baby Jesus, and Greg's the bakers did one year a Christmas advert with a sausage roll that was in a manger representing the baby Jesus, a little sausage. And that's terrible, and you can't do that. So some people are just are looking for things to be offended about, and I think these are the sorts of people who often then complain about virtue signaling and snowflakes. There's persistent ideas around Christmas parties. Again, if a company decides not to have a Christmas card party, it's probably because they're being cheap more than because any particular workplaces wants to ban Christmas. But many offices have changed their Christmas parties over the years, for example, to have less of a focus on alcohol consumption. And that's not an attack on Christmas, but people will find a way to pretend it is. Interestingly, a few years ago in this country, because of these just constant complaining about Christians being persecuted and this constant myth making, our Equality and Human Rights Commission they spent several years conducting a very extensive study of the law on religion and belief and how it was working, and they found no evidence at all that Christmas parties have been banned because people were getting offended. They found no evidence that Christians were being persecuted, and that study came out, And I don't mean to pick on one newspaper here, but the Daily Mail had an exclusive coverage of the EHRC's report, and they said, no, the EHRC says stop banning Christmas parties, when the EHRC said no one has ever banned Christmas parties. And also, some people get offended with people celebrating it in different ways. And this may lead into sort of some of the underlying thing of the war on Christmas myth is it's often just a cultural anxiety. Some people, I know, for example, it's been a couple of years now, but whenever I go to church on Christmas Eve, I look around and I see that it's basically all very old people, and that young people aren't really going to church. And I don't feel anything positive or negative about that, but I understand that some people take that very anxious, and people are very worried that we're losing the real meaning of Christmas, and Christianity is dying out. And every year that there's a group of MPs. I'm blanking on the name now, led by a particular DUP MP. Every year they sponsor an early day motion in Parliament reaffirming, the real reason for Christmas, and saying like, oh no, we reaffirm that people have the right to say Merry Christmas, etc., etc.
So would you say that those in the evangelical community who insist their faith is being persecuted are really coming from a place of social or even personal anxiety of some kind?
Definitely. I mean, the war on Christmas myth and the myth of persecution, it appeals to people's cultural anxieties and often sense of helplessness. It isn't going to appeal to the many Christians who are simply at ease with an increasingly secular and multicultural Britain. It's going to appeal to people who feel left out by that. So it is important to start from a place of empathy and to try and get people to question their beliefs rather than mocking them. And I personally recommend, if you can, asking questions. So, where did you hear that? Does that sound realistic to you? Why do you think they might have done that? Who do you think was offended by that? When did you get offended by that? Were you offended when you saw the advert, or did you get angry when you saw on Facebook someone saying how the advert was anti-Christian? That sort of open question asking. And also, a point I always make about this is it's very important, if we at a wider cultural level, to try and create opportunities for people to come together, and we need to embed a lot better media literacy among people to see how these news stories, often they're designed to manipulate you. If someone gets very angry and upset by it, I don't want to blame almost them. I want to try and help them to see the manipulation at work more.
Is all this coming mostly from America? And if so, why is it so prominent there?
The war on Christmas myth, it's predominantly an American cultural obsession. And the US is unique in its levels of religiosity among rich countries and among liberal democracies. So that plays a big part. American popular culture is the dominant popular culture around the world, so it's unsurprising that their cultural obsessions do end up getting exported out around the world. I mean, you have to also look at America's history. Remember that the US fought a civil war over some states' desire to protect white Christian supremacy. There's a long history of anxiety over white Christians losing their cultural dominance within the US, and the war on Christmas is just one example of that. So if you look back at the war on Christmas idea in the 1920s, I don't think that possibly made it over to the UK, but in the 1920s some Christians believed that the Jews were trying to steal Christmas, and in the 1950s they believed it was the communists trying to outlaw it. In the 60s and 70s it was those damn civil rights leaders, and they were probably going to make all Americans follow Kwanzaa instead. And in the 80s and 90s it was political correctness. In the 2000s those mean nasty atheists. In the 2010s it was probably a bit of everything.
So whoever they don't like at the time, basically. Would you say, Alistair, that some of these religious persecution narratives are being exported over here to England and even beyond?
Yes, and as I was talking about the part, that's the cultural dominance of America. I mean, we all, I think, find Americanisms entering our language more and more every year. On another recent episode of the podcast, we spoke to Rachel Lasser about what we called the Americanization of the religious right, and how religious groups in America are actually trying to start to influence this conversation much more wide-ranging. Fake news and urban legends have the ability to cross locations much quicker than real news, because you could just change the location in the story. Your viewers may be familiar with the QAnon conspiracy, which is something that's exclusively rooted in the United States. But such is the power of the internet that there's actually a ton of QAnon graffiti around my small village in West Sussex, England. Religious nationalists and conservatives in places such as the UK who despair at our secularization often look jealously at the power and even just simply the relevance of Christian nationalism and the Christian right in America. And there's also been a conscious effort by Christian nationalist groups to export their politics, including their cultural war politics, around the world. This is quoting research from Open Democracy. Since 2008, Christian nationalist groups from the US have spent more than $280 million on lobbying outside the US, including almost 90 million in Europe. So, there's money flowing there as well as cultural influence. The US political system is increasingly sorted along cultural rather than economic divides. The Republican Party of today is similar to the Democratic Party in the run up to the Civil War, and that level of cultural political sorting is not seen in any other liberal democracy. But among many liberal democracies, there are political movements who see that cultural sorting as not as actually something to aspire to. So we see similar movements Brazil, Canada, Australia, and yes, the UK.
Okay, that was a very interesting analysis of the so-called war on Christmas, and I'm very glad that you've been able to take some time out of your schedule to come onto the show and share your findings. So what are you working on at the moment, Alistair? What's coming up?
It's an exciting time at the NSS, as it always is. We actually recently released on our podcast a year in review, which was kind of looking back at 2020. Not that I want to spend too long looking back at 2020 and ahead to 2021. And I have work to do around curriculum reform in Wales, particularly around religion and belief education. We've got 2 pretty substantial pieces of research on education issues to be published in the next few months. And for me personally, the No More Face Wars campaign will be a high priority. And I'm just looking forward to being able to get out and to speak to local groups and to do more local campaigning that is so hampered by COVID.
And of course, a new child in the house as well.
Oh, actually, no, they're getting on for 18 months. But it's been the one silver lining I would say this year is I had 3 or 4 months off at the beginning of the year, but since then I've been able to be around a lot. And working from home has its positives and its negatives.
I will leave links to your social media and for the National Secular Society in the description below. And all that's left to say is thank you very much indeed, Alistair, for coming on to Talk Beliefs.
Thanks so much. I'm wishing you and your audience a Merry Christmas, while we're still legally allowed to say that, apparently. Happy holidays, while that still offends some people, and prosperous New Year.
Yes, happy Winterville to you.